The problem is, this problem has been growing for the last 20 years. House prices have gone up 4 times over the last 20 years, while wages have gone up 2 times. That's why we're in this mess. But that is why we've got a lot of work and lots of different types of things we need to do to try and fix it. So, that policy, I'm like, it will help some people, but it's not actually going to make a fundamental difference to this problem.
The Get Rich Slow Club podcast is a collaboration between Tash Etchman from Tash Invest and Anna Christina from Perla. The Get Rich Slow Club acknowledges the traditional custodians of the land we record on. From coast to coast, across land, waters, and communities, we pay our respects to elders past, present, and emerging. Any advice is general and does not consider your financial situation, needs, or objectives, so consider whether it's appropriate for you.
Welcome to the Get Rich Slow Club podcast,
where we take you from beginner to confident investor,
where we can teach you everything you need to know about investing.
So come get rich slow with us.
Today I'm chatting to Allegra Spender, who is an independent MP for Wentworth and a strong voice in Australian politics when it comes to climate and tax reform. We chat about her career journey before politics, what bracket creep is and why you should care, why Australia needs tax reform, and lots more. Thank you so much for joining us today. Before we kick it off, can you let me know what your money win or loss is of the day or the week?
For the week, so I was getting a builder to do a little bit of work at home, and I didn't look at the bill carefully enough, or the quote carefully enough, and I thought that sort of rubbish removal and stuff like that was part of it, and it wasn't. And then I got a bit of bill shock in the end because it was on top. So it was a real reminder of, ask questions up front, particularly if you're doing a piece of work and you're conscious of the cost. Because if you don't get really clear on what's included and what isn't included, sometimes you can get done in the end.
Yeah, that's the thing. So you don't really think about it if you haven't done that before and you don't know about it?
Exactly right.
Did you get multiple quotes or was that the only one?
No, I got multiple.
Okay. And did some of them include the rubbish removal?
Yeah, there was, just different models. Yeah.
Good reminder to just have a look.
Yeah, exactly right.
Yeah. Tell me a little bit about your childhood. So you're a politician now, but I always love to know how politicians even become politicians. So starting off with your childhood, what was that like?
Look, I had probably a bit unusual in that my dad was actually a politician, but he was a politician for the Liberal Party. So I remember door knocking with Dad, and I was so embarrassed. I was like, oh my God, this is so embarrassing. When I was 10 years old, I wouldn't even walk up to the door. I'd sort of hang out by the gate and be mortified. So it was interesting, but Dad lost his seat when I was 12. So I remember really vividly when he lost his job as a politician. You would think that would stop me doing this. And then my mum was a fashion designer, and her story really influenced me a lot because she was someone who came to Australia, didn't speak English, didn't have any money, left school at 14, and then she started her own business. And then she got myself and my sister and my brother in her business. We started working there when we were about 11 and worked all the school holidays, all uni holidays, because she wanted us to understand how hard it was to run a business, and she wanted us to actually learn about money and learn about business really early on, because it was through business that she was able to create a life for herself and for the family.
Did your mum just openly talk about money with you?
She did in sort of money lessons. She had an interesting time because she started her business and then her first husband came in and then they got divorced. And so she had a 9-month-old son at that time, my brother, was a single mum. This is back in the late 60s when women didn't have businesses. She went to the bank. They wouldn't give her a loan because they're like, oh, you're just going to get married again and you're not serious about it. So her lesson to me, particularly as a woman, was that women need to take control of their finances. And so my parents were a bit different to a lot of people that, they had common, things that they both put money into, but they always had their own accounts and they always had that sort of financial independence. And that financial independence and that focus on career, a woman's career, don't give that up, was a really important lesson for me from mum in particular, and particularly that experience of, getting divorced and having to start again and in tough times. That's what she taught me.
What kind of beliefs did you have around money back then? Were there common themes that came up? Like, was money very stressful, or was it just like, this is a tool, am I going to move forward with it?
Look, Mum almost lost her business when I was a kid. So she had bought a property in the sort of the late 80s, early 90s. So she'd basically spent too much money trying to make investments, and suddenly they weren't worth what they were before. So she was actually, going backwards. And so the bank at some stage said they were going to call in the loan and she was going to lose everything, including the business. She'd worked for 20 years. And, and so I remember that time really well because I was working in her business at the time as a kid. And I remember every time we got a check in, we went straight to the bank and checked it, and every dollar that the business spent, because the only way she could get out of debt was through sort of growing the business. That was the only way she could get out of this debt, because she had built property. So it was a massive lesson to me, both about, just not overextending, because assets don't always go up in value. And that was a really stark reminder for her at the time. Interest rates were incredibly high. And again, that taught me to be pretty cautious in relation to interest rates. But also, in small business in particular, you need to get paid. And that was a big lesson for her and for me. And it's actually something I've tried to pursue in Parliament, is that for a lot of small businesses, cash flow is king. And if they can't get the cash in the door, they're not going to be able to survive. So that's, working out when you're going to get paid, making sure that you're on it and you chase those payments is really, really important.
And that you're actually making money. I see a lot of people quoting revenue figures, which is amazing. But if you're not making any profit, it's a hard one.
Yeah, it's really, really hard.
What did you decide to study at uni?
Look, I started studying arts law, but then I ended up changing to economics, and I did that because I liked maths and, science and those things. But I also wanted to understand how the world worked. I also, I was very idealistic as a young person, still am somewhat, and wanted to see how do you make the world a better place. And I thought economics was an interesting part in that, because so much comes down to economics. So much of what you can do, what you can't do, comes down to economics. So I really love that. But it was one of those things that, you don't always, you think you want to do one thing and then you change and do something else. And that, again, is pretty hard sometimes as a young person.
I love that you can try so many different things though. And you've had such a really cool career. What were some of the things you did after uni?
Look, I've had a really varied career. I started out in consulting in business. Then I worked for the UK Treasury, which, looking after sort of public finance. Then I lived in Kenya. I worked for a not-for-profit. Yeah.
Oh, I just got back from Kenya.
Oh, did you?
Yeah.
Fabulous. Whereabouts were you?
I went to Uganda to hike with the gorillas, and then I went to Nairobi and Diani Beach. Yeah, it was really lovely.
Yeah, we hiked with the gorillas too. Yeah. Actually incredible in Uganda. So I went to Kenya, lived there for 9 months in Nairobi, working with a not-for-profit helping banana farmers grow their businesses. I then worked for a hospital in the UK in terms of how to run the hospital better. Then I ran our family's fashion business for 10 years. Then I ran a not-for-profit in education. So I feel like I've done, almost every job, every industry. But there's one of the things I realize, longer I've gone in my career, things that you learn in one job often are quite transferable, particularly management and financial management. Those are very transferable skills in other jobs.
Yeah, I studied occupational therapy. So that's what I did before this. Yeah, and some of those skills are very transferable in terms of talking to people and building relationships and communicating in a certain way.
Yeah.
Yeah, so lots of things you can do. How did you decide to actually get into politics if you were doing all this wonderful stuff?
Look, it's a really hard decision. A bit unusually, I got approached by a group of people in the area who thought that there was an opportunity for an independent to run in Wentworth because they'd seen what happened in Warringah, and they thought that there was an opportunity for someone who cared about the environment but also cared about business and also cared about community to run in Wentworth. And someone referred me to that because they knew me. And I remember that first conversation. When I heard what the question was, I laughed and said, "Look, I'm incredibly flattered that you'd even think of me, but no." And it was the hardest decision I've ever had to make. I've got 3 youngish kids. They were younger then. I had a job I loved. I had dual nationality, which I had to give up my Italian citizenship, but I did it. And I was afraid. I mean, to do something that's so public where people will want to take you down, and so uncertain was intimidating. But I ultimately decided, look, there are some really important things. Climate is one of them. Frankly, having 50-50 representation of men and women in Parliament is another really important part. And I thought, you know what? If the worst that can happen is that I fail, and fail publicly, as a public humiliation. But that's the worst that can happen, and it's important. It's worth doing, and so that's why I decided to do it.
How have you found it so far?
I've loved it.
That's good.
It's got there's enormous joy in the job. I know people don't necessarily expect that, but particularly you meet amazing people, and you meet as I said, I studied economics, so I've met amazing economists, and that's very exciting. But you actually just meet a lot of people locally and see parts of the community, that you haven't otherwise seen. So like I grew up in the East. I've lived, in the East all my life except overseas. But I've met, people like, went to a place in Darling Point, which has dementia care for a sort of day centre for people with dementia, and talking to those people and listening to their stories and them teasing each other about the fact that they were losing their memories. I mean, that was really inspiring because of the courage that they showed. But also then people come and talk to you about very hard times in their lives, and sometimes you can help them. And that also gives a huge amount of joy and a huge amount of satisfaction, as well as the much sort of bigger public policy pieces.
Do you feel like you are really making a difference?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, in ways big and small through, sometimes it's helping an individual. Like there's a woman who came to me, and she's in part of the army, and she was pregnant, and she was meant to be posted overseas, but because she was pregnant, she couldn't be posted in an active sense. She was deployed. And for some technical reason, she couldn't be paid parental leave. And that was just insane. And she contacted our office. And so we're in the process of really fighting this with the government. And so doing, that's a little thing. Then other days it's about, making climate legislation better and stronger, or helping, students with HECS debt and, helping make that change. But the point is that sometimes it is the individuals you help that give you the greatest satisfaction, as well as the big policy pieces.
Yeah, I miss that about working in healthcare sometimes, is having that one-on-one impact to someone where you can really see what's happening. But it's great that you get a mix of both, like changing greater policy, but also getting to talk to individuals like that.
Yeah, it is. And I think it is those, people who have, been given flowers and cakes and stuff like that, helping people with visas when, there's someone's unwell and they need to rush through a visa so that a family member can come home, helping a refugee who was in a detention for 13 years, immigration detention, and help him get out. Like that sort of stuff you never forget. It is that personal connection, as well as kind of the more abstract policy pieces.
Yeah. I'm really curious about your family's response to you becoming an independent. If you come from a very liberal family, how did they take that?
Look, my dad, it's funny, my dad lost his seat to an independent. So it was even more personal for him. One of the first independents, not Ted Mack, in North Sydney. But for me, look, Dad was what was special about Dad was he always had an open mind. And he, at the start, when I said I'd been approached, he actually wrote me this email in the middle of the night saying, basically a long list of reasons why I shouldn't do it. And I think it was as much about politics and his, I think, fear about, his daughter going into something which is rough and tumble, can be very brutal, as much as sort of the Liberal Party. But then in the end, by the time I made the decision to run, he was 150% behind me. And he's passed away, unfortunately, soon after I got elected. But I've got a very special photo I have is of me and him wearing one of my T-shirts. And that was a really, really beautiful moment, actually, in my family.
Yeah. I love the email aspect too. I feel like my parents email me all the time for stuff, so I can imagine the email popping into your inbox being like, don't do this.
It's like, it's a very long email. It's one I'm glad I've got. I don't think I'm going to get rid of that quickly.
Good to reflect on.
Yeah.
One of your big policies I've kind of read up about or seen talked about is your tax reform. I think you wrote or had a paper written about that.
Yeah.
Can you explain a bit about that and what the purpose was behind it?
Yeah, sure. Look, I care about things that matter to people, and there are three things I really worry about at the moment. One of which is that young people are struggling to get ahead the way that their parents did. I met a young guy at King's Cross train station just the other day, and he said, I've got a great job, but I just have no idea I'm ever going to be able to, have a house or have the life that my parents did. He said, my grandparents, they came to Australia, they worked in a factory, they didn't get degrees, and they still could create a good life, but I'm not sure I can do that. And so I have a real concern about intergenerational equity and how do we help young people. The second piece I also worried about is how do we help our businesses be productive and grow and thrive and innovate, because that's what drives the economy. That's what enables people, for us to pay for the health system that we want, but also gives people jobs. And finally, the climate transition. Now, all those three things are big economic issues, and they're all can be significantly influenced by the tax system. So that's why I ended up working on tax, because it's the issues that matter. It's about helping young people, helping our businesses, and transitioning climate. But let's make sure we use all the tools for it. And I was really frustrated coming into the last election and since that the major parties just don't want to talk about tax because they wedge and, use it so badly as weapons against each other that it's become impossible for them to talk about tax reform. So I've said, right, okay, I'm going to go through a tax reform process. I'm going to consult experts. I'm going to talk to my community and start to try and put tax on the table as an important issue because it affects people's lives. And, the job of the government is to make people's lives better. And I think by ignoring tax reform, we're ignoring one of the big levers we can pull to make people's lives better.
What is wrong with the tax system?
Look, one of the big things that's wrong, particularly at the individual level, is that we rely a lot on the individual income tax compared to other taxes. And what that means is particularly workers, if you don't have, people don't get to choose if their parents have, can help them on big things. The only thing people can choose or affect is, whether they can work and if they can work, the choices they can work in terms of what money that they can earn that way. But if most people just earn wages, that's what they can control. But if we keep on focusing our tax system really around income, it means for a lot of people, we're just putting a lot of weight on workers, and particularly young workers, when rather than other parts of the tax system. And I think particularly when younger people are struggling now with HECS debts, with higher property prices, we need to be putting less burden on young workers and more across other parts of the tax system, so that young people can get ahead, can, have more sort of security in housing and can sort of create those different options in lives that their parents did.
I've tried to talk about this on social media very briefly. And the response I got was that, well, boomers have worked really hard. So why would we try and tax their assets more or tax their super more or tax inheritance instead? How would you address that?
Look, I think that this isn't a question of people haven't worked hard. And this is, of every, a lot of people and including my parents, I have huge respect for what they've put into the system. And I think it's really important that we don't turn this into a sort of generational war or class war. But the point I'm trying to make is if you look at our system, right, from 2004, I think, to 2016, so just over 10 years, you saw that the wealth of households over the age of 65 grew by about 50%. But the wealth of households under the age of 35 basically didn't move. And so what we've had two different kind of experiences. And I don't think anyone in this country would have said, this is what we want. But we have a tax system and a, housing and other system that has ended up as that outcome. And so I think we just have to come back to, if that's not what we wanted, then, we've got to change the system, or that we will get more of this, which is basically, more of that, it just exacerbated. So that's kind of how I think of it. And it's no one's done anything wrong. No one's been mean or unfair, but it's just more about saying, I think we can unite to say, I want this country to be a place where, everybody has a chance to build a good life for themselves, right? And that if you work hard, whether you're a CEO of a company or whether, you work in retail or you're a healthcare assistant, that, if you have a good, job where you're making a real effort and trying, that you can create a good life for yourself. And I think we're getting a bit away from that. And I think that's a problem. And I think we have to stop it in its tracks.
How do we actually fix that? Because it sounds like a wonderful dream to feel like everyone can afford the things that they need.
Look, it's never going to be perfect. But so I think that's why I think we need a tax reform process. And I think we need to, shift the tax system, particularly at the personal level, away from income tax and also to sort of tilt the balance back towards home ownership, because I think that's a real problem. And that's, how do we do that? Look, a big thing I've been pushing and pushed in a paper that I sort of kicked off, try and kick off this discussion, is to say, well, in the next parliament, to try and have in the first year a tax reform process where we get experts, but we also get community, like we talk to real people about what they think about tax and try and see if we can come up with some reforms that a government has to respond to, so we can get these sorts of conversations back on the table, because this is important.
Yeah, it's hard to talk about tax because it feels very confusing.
Yeah.
Do you have a way that we could be able to address that and make it less confusing for people?
Yeah, look, I think people are really scared of it, and people go, a lot of people say, well, look, I'm no expert.
Yeah, I'm not good at maths, so I don't understand.
Yeah. And I think probably the starting point is actually just starting to work out, how does even the tax that you pay, how does that work? And I think one of the things, that is sort of a part of tax I'm really interested in is what they call bracket creep. And maybe it's useful. If it's useful, shall I explain what that is?
Yeah, definitely explain it.
Yeah, because I've heard that term before, but I had to do the maths actually to start to really work out how it works. So basically, what happens is, we have a tax system where, you don't pay any tax under a certain, if your income's under, I think basically 18,000, then you pay a different rate, at different levels, and it sort of goes up at different levels. And so the more you earn, the higher, you pay on the money over that sort of threshold.
Yeah, the marginal tax rate.
That's the marginal tax rate. And one of the challenges is so let's say, you get a 5% pay increase, but inflation's 5%. So if you get a 5% pay increase and inflation's 5%, well, most people would say, you know what, I'm okay. I'm sort of just treading water. I'm not going ahead, but I'm not going backwards. But because because more of your income is taxed at a higher rate, particularly if your income then clicks over into another tax bracket where it's taxed at a much higher rate, you end up paying more tax. And if, to use an example, for around, if you're earning around $60,000 a year and it's 2.5% inflation, 2.5% increase, the difference is around $300 of money that effectively is going out of your kind of what you can purchase and into tax, and it goes up at different levels, and every year it builds on that. So that's one of the things I think we should do is to index our brackets so that, if a threshold is at $30,000, the next year it's $30,000 plus inflation, so maybe it's $31,000 and it's $32,000. So people aren't going backwards if their income is going up, but so is inflation.
Why doesn't that happen already? Because we index, like people hear about indexation for our HECS debt, so why aren't the tax brackets indexed?
Well, so lots of countries around the world do index their tax brackets, including the US and Canada. Why doesn't it happen? Because to be honest, it's an easy way for governments to raise more revenue without telling anyone that they're raising taxes.
Okay.
So it's something that's really, if you're in government, it's a really good one because it's the one way you don't have to tell anyone you're raising taxes, but you are actually raising taxes, but through bracket creep. But most people don't notice because most people don't go through, their sort of tax details and work out, well, what did I earn last year and how has inflation been and stuff like that. Most of us just pay our taxes. So I think it's a sneaky tax. And I think it's one that, we do need to, particularly for young people, we need to say, hey, if you're raising our taxes, tell us you're raising our taxes rather than just put up our taxes by stealth.
Are any of the major parties proposing they would do that as well?
Not at this stage. I mean, it's interesting. It used to be the Liberal Party policy. So back in the, back in the 80s, it was Liberal Party policy, and then they stopped doing it. So, but this is my challenge to the major parties. The major parties aren't really talking about tax at all. And I think this is why it needs to be on the table, because it affects people's lives. And we need to make sure, particularly that our young people are having a chance to get ahead.
Yeah. What are some other policies? So tax bracket creep is a really good one. What are some other ones you're proposing?
In terms of tax?
Yeah.
Yeah, look, I think the other one is another really important one is around how do we incentivize companies to invest. So because one of the, you might hear a big topic called productivity. I don't know, everyone sort of talks about productivity, and that basically productivity is about how do businesses do more, create more things with the same resources, say, and that. So it's just doing things smarter, effectively. So one way to do things smarter is often to sort of make investments in in new technology or trying new ways of doing things. But you're not seeing a lot of business investment at the moment. So it's around sort of non-mining business investments at a real low at the moment, which means that we're not kind of investing in being smart in the future, and that's a problem. So that's so I think we need to look at how do we incentivize businesses to make those sorts of investments.
Yeah, and stop people going over to the US to start their businesses.
Yeah,
I've got a
exactly.
few friends who go to San Francisco because that's where you get all the investment there.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really big part as well. It's how do we get more backing for startups and scale-ups here? Because, we have about around a third of the venture capital, that sort of early stage capital for early stage businesses in Australia compared to the US, and about half the UK per capita. So that's a bit technical how we can do that, but I think that's where we've got an opportunity to work with our super funds who have lots of money but aren't doing that much investing in young businesses. And so we do need to get more investment towards young businesses to help them grow.
What do you think, now that you've mentioned super, what do you think about the Liberals' policy where they've proposed for young people to be able to use their super to buy their first home?
Look, I think it will help some people, and I can see why for a lot of people, they want to be able to do that. But I think it is not going to solve fundamentally the problem that we've got. And I think it's going to also, the people who do take it out of super are going to have the effects later in life when they don't have as much super when they retire. But there are a lot of people where they just don't have enough super anyway to make a fundamental difference. So, some people may get a benefit from this. I think a lot of people won't. And it doesn't fundamentally change the fact that, the biggest issue we have in housing is a lack of supply. And that we need to build more homes around the country to meet the demand. Because, if you look at Australia, we have around 400 homes per 1,000 population. In somewhere like France, they've got like 600 homes per 1,000 population. And it is much cheaper to buy a house in France and a place to live than it is in Australia. So,
crazy, because you think of France, you think, oh, that must be more expensive. But no.
I know you do. But yeah, so there are a bunch of things. And we also need to work out how do we make building houses less expensive and slow at the moment. So there's a bunch of things. None of this is easy. And I know that's really hard for people because, there are no simple answers. The problem is, this problem has been growing for the last 20 years. House prices have gone up 4 times over the last 20 years, while wages have gone up 2 times. That's why we're in this mess. But that is why we've got a lot of work and lots of different types of things we need to do to try and fix it. So, that policy, I'm like, it will help some people, but it's not actually going to make a fundamental difference to this problem.
Yeah, it seems just like a Band-Aid solution if you're still not building more homes.
Yeah, it is. It is definitely a Band-Aid solution. And yeah. So it's, again, there are a lot of policies out there which sound good, but don't actually make a difference. I think we've had a lot of housing policies out there like that for a long time.
Yeah, definitely. With the first home buyers grant and stuff like that, that's all amazing to help first home buyers, but again, doesn't actually increase housing supply.
Yeah, and I think there's a sort of a bunch of evidence out there to say that it actually drove up the cost of first homes on the basis that everyone had that extra money, so everybody used that to bid against each other, which actually meant that nobody got real benefit from it.
No, which is unfortunate.
Yeah.
Another fun one I see on social media is that we should just get rid of capital gains tax discount and negative gearing, and that would fix the housing crisis. What is your point on that, just from a housing crisis perspective, but then also the future of tax as well?
Look, I think we should look at those. And, what I put forward was called this green paper, which is just kind of like an options paper and paper based on sort of the experts I spoke to and the community I spoke to. And certainly there are a lot of people out there who say, hey, we should do this. But I think the impact on housing is not going to be as big as people think. Again, I think a lot of people think, oh, well, if we change that, suddenly everyone could afford homes. That wouldn't be the case. I think the sort of evidence coming out of the Grattan Institute and others saying it might make a 2 to 4% difference in terms of house pricing, but it won't make a really fundamental difference. I think the question, it's worth considering options around that if it could be used to fund a reduction in income tax. So I think that's why I think it should be on the table. I think, we're going to have to put lots of tricky things on the table if we are going to actually reduce income tax. And so I put on there, but there's no silver bullet on, and unfortunately, those tax changes aren't one either.
Yeah. One that I read in your paper was removing stamp duty and how that would increase housing supply just by people moving around a bit more. Can you explain why that would happen?
Yeah. So stamp duty is one that is a really interesting one. And I think it's both, for me, actually trying to get rid of stamp duty is both about fairness, but it is also about home ownership, because stamp duty is a taxation on moving. So if you're someone who, for instance, bought a house with a partner and then you split up and you had to sell the house, you'll end up paying twice the stamp duty as somebody who didn't split up but just stayed in the one place. Or if you have to move, so you start out in Sydney and then you decide you're going to have to move, you want to move to regional New South Wales for a job, so you sell your house and you buy another house, and you pay twice the tax as somebody who stays put. And so that's why I think stamp duty is an unfair tax, because it's about, people pay tax based on, life choices that have nothing to do about your ability to pay tax or what's fair. And I just think that's genuinely unfair. The other challenge on stamp duty is it stops people moving because people don't want to have to pay stamp duty again. And so, again, if you're someone who's in a bigger house and you feel like you should downsize, which, there are a whole bunch of people who, probably would consider downsizing, but then think, well, I'm just going to end up paying all this tax to buy a new place. That's bad, because what you want is people to move into the houses that are the right shape and size for them. So, when they're, if they're, if they grow out a family or getting a family, to move into a house with more bedrooms once, when the family have left home, to move in a house with fewer bedrooms, that would be good. But stamp duty is a barrier to doing that. And that's why it's a state tax. But I think the federal government should be involved in trying to reduce stamp duty and, potentially swap it into land tax as a different way of raising that revenue.
What are people's opinions on land tax? Do you get people opposing that, or are they welcoming it?
I think there are people who don't like land tax, and I understand it, because stamp duty is a one-off tax and land tax is an ongoing one. But I think, when you're looking at younger people, we know that stamp duty is a massive barrier to people getting into housing. And we also know and that New South Wales Treasury has estimated that you get around 7% higher home ownership if you got rid of stamp duty and replace it with land tax. So, which is a big difference.
Yeah, it's bigger than the estimated from removing negative gearing.
Yeah. So it is bigger than, you're right, bigger than estimated from negative gearing. And the difference is also, what they found is that New South Wales did a program where it was optional, where people could either, say, I'll pay stamp duty but won't pay land tax, or you can commit to paying land tax on that property. And lots of people chose to pay land tax. So I feel like if you did it that way, where people get to opt in, that's I think a good way at least to start it and get more properties on that basis. Then people have that choice. If you're really, worried that for some people that didn't work, I think that's a pretty interesting way of doing it.
Yeah, that sounds great. It's just really frustrating, hearing that as someone where you're like, this policy makes so much sense. Why is this just not happening? Is it a lack of understanding, or it's just not popular enough to talk about?
I think a bit of both. And look, there are reasons why people don't like it, but I think I think as a country, we need to think really, really hard about how do we help young people get into housing and have the options that their parents did. And I think that means that it's not everyone's going to like all solutions, but I think most people think that we want to be a country where people have access to housing. And I think so we're going to have to do some things that we might not all love individually, but we've got a bigger aim here. And I think we've got to try and stick with that.
I found it really interesting reading about Medicare and how much that was opposed when that first came in. Yeah. That kind of blew my mind, because that makes a lot of sense these days. We're like, it's a great policy. We all really, most of us really like it. But the fact that it took so long to get in, and people, even doctors were opposing it, is just wild to reflect on.
Yeah, I know, you're right. Some change is hard. And it's interesting. Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. If it was easy, we probably have done it by now.
I find there's a little bit of a link between the housing conversation and climate change as well. I rent, and I would love to buy eventually in the future. I own an investment property back in Perth, but I've been moving around and I live in Melbourne now, but I can't really get solar panels on a rental. And I find that's quite hard for young people who care about climate change, but they feel like they can't really do a whole lot if they're renting. And that's quite a challenge. Yeah,
it's a huge one. And actually, for me, it's a really big one, partly because in my area, we've got about 40% of my community rents. So a really big rental group. And so what we're trying to push at the moment is incentives for landlords to put solar on rental properties or upgrade appliances. So because sometimes solar doesn't work for the property, but, you've got gas in your kitchen. If you had an electric stove, that would be cheaper to run, or, it needs better insulation. That would actually mean sort of less heating and cooling costs. So I've put forward this proposal which would try and help, homeowners more with batteries, your rental properties really on these upgrades, but also for social housing, solar panels and batteries as well, so that, people who live in social housing, who are some of the most vulnerable in our community, can do that. And we also need to make it easier for apartments, actually. And so that's, again, we've actually made some progress in this term on this, so through various schemes called solar bank schemes and things like that, which now make it easier for people to put solar on apartments and to share that appropriately. Because, a lot of people around here live in apartments. 60% of the community in Wentworth live in apartments. And a lot of those people want to do, try and do the right thing, but it's really hard and complicated.
Yeah. Can I ask you about nuclear energy? Sure. What are your thoughts on that?
Look, nuclear, I've always been someone who cares about climate change. And then I also care about, and doing it in a way that costs as least, doing the right things, but as least cost as possible, right? And so for me, nuclear is part of the energy mix around the world. But, I keep on looking at it and I just don't think it makes sense here. And the reason is, let's just talk energy first before we talk climate. The next 10 years really matters in our energy transition because 90% of our coal-fired power stations are going to close in the next 10 years. So we've got to, and nuclear is not an option in the next 10 years. No, I mean, I don't think anyone is saying, we're going to have nuclear power that's going to replace coal in time for the coal-fired power stations to close. So what do we do? What we should do is do what is both clean but also cheap. And the cheapest thing and cleanest thing we can do is put renewables in, backed up by batteries and gas, when the sun doesn't shine and the wind doesn't blow and you need it, really urgently. That's the best thing for household budgets, for the overall cost, but also for climate. And then you sort of go, well, if we replace most of our grid with renewables and batteries by 2035, why do we need nuclear? And I don't have an answer to that. And then it's the cost. There are estimates between $300 and $600 billion worth of money to buy these nuclear reactors. The government or the coalition has said that the government would have to pay because no private investors are going to pay for it. And I'm just really concerned that means just more cost on the public purse, which is ultimately comes down to taxpayers, without the benefits and certainly without cheaper energy. So I just don't think it makes sense here because, the wind, with solar here is just so efficient. A solar panel here creates 2 to 3 times more electricity than it does in a place like Germany or Japan. So we're really well set up for solar. We should just do that.
Why are they pushing it then? Because it makes no sense to me either when I've looked into it. And like my dad works in mining, so he's got a different lens, but even he's like, it won't work here either. So it's interesting watching a political party push it so heavily.
I don't know. It's interesting they've stopped pushing it as much in the last few months. They're not sort of leading with it, and you won't see it as much in the in sort of some of their websites and stuff like that. And I think I worry, I'll be honest, that it's something that they're not really serious about. You see Matt Canavan saying, nuclear's, it's never going to happen, but it's a great sort of a distraction. But I think the truth is that, it's been estimated now that if we stuck with this nuclear plan, even if they actually managed to get the nuclear plan up and running, we'd have 2 billion more tons of emissions because of keeping on gas and coal while they wait for nuclear, because a key part of their nuclear plan is to stop the rollout of renewables and it's to sort of double down into coal and gas until the nuclear plan is ready. So I just think it's bad policy. I don't know why they keep on pushing it. They don't seem to, I'm really concerned that they're not even serious about it at all. But I just can't see any argument for why this is a good policy for Australia.
Yeah, I think a lot of people just don't trust anything will work to timelines either. Like we're still waiting for a train in Melbourne to get to the airport. Like that would be nice first, but maybe nuclear reactors will be around.
Yeah, look, they just take a long time. It's interesting. I think there's one happening in the UK at the moment, a nuclear power plant that is literally 14 years overdue. So it's just taking forever. And so I think that's the real problem, particularly if we're trying to build something we've never built before here, which is a large-scale nuclear plant, that it just won't be done on time. But, my view is keep your options open. I think you should, I always see how technology evolves, but on the basis of the technology right now, no,
maybe
it just doesn't make sense.
We could revisit.
Maybe in 10 years it will be different. Maybe you'll have small modular nuclear reactors. They just don't exist commercially yet. So I think it would be really crazy to bet the house on something that we don't know is actually going to work or we can deploy in time.
If you could change one policy just really quickly at the moment, what would you change?
I would probably change tax. I think I would. Yeah, because I just think, because I think on climate, for instance, I care a lot about climate, but I think we are actually on the right track. The job we have on climate is to keep going and go a bit faster. But on tax, I think it is hard, and I really, really I think we're really in danger if we don't actually fix things for young people.
I love that. Thank you so much for joining us. This has been so much fun.
That's been great. Thank you so much for having me.
Thanks so much for joining us. If you found this episode helpful, please rate us 5 stars, write a review, or share with a friend. If you're new to investing, make sure to listen to our first 10 episodes. Follow us at Get Rich Slow Club or Tash at Tash Invests or me at Ana Cristina.
This show was brought to you by Natasha Etchman, who is an authorised representative 1299881 of Guideway Financial Services, AFSL 420367. and Perla, who is an authorised representative 1281540 of Sanlam Private Wealth AFSL 337927. Knowledge is power, especially when it comes to investing, so make sure you check out our financial services guides and read the product disclosure statement and target market determination for any investments you're considering. See our show notes for more info.